Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a joint hearing between the House Human Services Committee and the Senate Health and Welfare Committee to hear the results of the task force report on homelessness that was commissioned over the course of the last summer and fall. And I think we should do introductions since it's the first time we've been together, right?
An excellent idea.
All right. I'm Teresa Wood. I'm Chair of House Human Services. I live in Waterbury and I also serve Bolton, Gulscore, and Huntington.
So good morning, everyone. It's really great to have both committees together. We haven't done that this year. It's the first time. I'm Senator Ginny Lyons and I chair Senate Health and Welfare. I represent Chittenden Southeast and live in Williston.
I'm Ann Cummings. I'm on Senate Health and Welfare. I chair Finance. And I represent Washington District, which right here, and one town in Memorial and a couple in Orange.
Hi, everyone. Senator Martine LaRocque-Ulick. I am Vice Chair of Health and Welfare, and I'm on Finance in the afternoon. I live in Burlington. I represent most of Burlington, all of Winooski, all of the city of Essex Junction, part of Essex Town, and part of Colchester.
I'm Representative Van Donahue. I'm from Northfield and also represent Berlin.
Hi, good morning, Representative Eric McGuire, Rutland City.
Julie McGill. I live in Bridport and I also represent Middlebury, New Haven, and Weybridge.
Hello, I'm Esme Cole and I represent Hartford.
I'm Senator Sam Douglas. I represent 15 towns in Orleans County, 4 in Caledonia and 1 in Franklin. Oh, yeah.
Good morning. My name is Zahn Eastis. I live in Guilford and I represent Guilford and Vernon, bottom state.
Good morning, Representative Todd Nielsen. I represent Brandon and Forest Hill.
Morning, I'm Dan Noyce. I represent Wolcott, Hyde Park, Johnson, and Belvedere.
Morning, I'm Senator Larry Hart from Orange County. I represent most of Orange County except for Thetford and
Orange.
and Braintree and Newberry.
And Orange.
And Orange, I don't. You get Orange.
I have Orange and Braintree.
Even though they're in Orange County.
Orange County is well represented.
Yes.
Washington is in.
I have Washington in Orange.
Doug Bishop, I represent Colchester's Chittenden 20 district, and the fourth part of Colchester is well represented between their senator and their representative.
And I'm Ray Garofano. I represent Essex and Essex Junction.
We'd like to go around the room so everybody knows who's in the room.
Good morning, my name is Monica Medeiros. I'm the Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs for Economic Services within the Department of Control and Education.
Hi, Beverly Bilgett from the Vermont Early Childhood Advocacy Alliance.
I am Em Eilert. I'm an intern with the Jackson Group.
Nice to see you again.
I'm Beth Ann Mayer. I do a lot of shelter work with in the churches, and I'm with Vermont International.
I'm Ross. I live in South Burlington, and I'm with the Vermont Hitchhiker Action as well.
Amy Johnson, Vermont Care Partners. I was also a task force member for the GA housing.
Katie McGlynn, Office of Legislative Counsel.
Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning. This is an important report that we're going to hear about, issue that is really center stage for many Vermonters, many communities. And so we look forward to hearing the report of the task force. But before we do, we are going to hear what the task force charge was, and Katie McGlynn from Legislative Counsel is going to review that with us.
Good morning.
Katie McGlynn, Office of Legislative Counsel. Let me pull up the language. Oops. Kiki and Lori, I need sharing permission. Success. Okay. So I am pulling up language from the budget, which is where this task force charge eventually ended up. But just a reminder for those of you who were here, and for those of you who weren't here, both committees worked on this language quite a bit before it ended up in the budget. The task force language was in a separate standalone bill that was separate from the budget. It originated in House Human Services. Senate Health and Welfare spent a lot of time looking at it. And eventually this language was taken out of a standalone bill and was added to the budget. So here's the language. First, we have language just establishing the General Assistance Emergency Housing Task Force to provide recommendations to the General Assembly regarding the statewide and local operation of General Assistance Emergency Housing benefit. We go into a list of the membership. So 2 representatives with lived experience of homelessness, 1 representative appointed by the Speaker and 1 appointed by the Pro Tem, a representative appointed by the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont, a representative appointed by the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, a representative appointed by Vermont Care Partners, a representative appointed by the Long-Term Care Crisis Coalition, a representative appointed by Vermont 211, a representative appointed by the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, a representative appointed by the Vermont Center for Independent Living, a representative with experience operating an emergency shelter program appointed jointly by the Speaker and Pro Tem, the Commissioner for DCF or designee, the Deputy Commissioner for DCS, Division of Economic Services, and lastly, the Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development or designee. And then we go into the responsibilities of this task force. So the task force is charged with examining and providing recommendations on the following. First, household eligibility, maximum days of eligibility, application, notice, and appeals processes for the program, participant requirements, and annual reporting requirements. The process to establish a single statewide unified coordinated entry system with participation from the department, the current organization of roles and responsibilities within DCF's Office of Economic Opportunity and Division of Economic Services, the number and type of emergency shelter spaces needed and currently available for each geographic region in the state, with a preference for non-congregate shelter spaces. Fifth, the identification of a consistent lead agency for each geographic region. The identification of role and responsibilities assigned to the lead agency. Any potential adjustments to emergency housing policy during cold weather months. A process to enable participating households to place a percentage of the household's gross income into savings, which shall be returned to the household for permanent housing expenses when the household exits GA emergency housing. A mechanism for addressing potential conduct challenges posed by a member of a participating household that is served in a motel, hotel, or shelter. The identification of any state rules and local regulations and ordinances that are impeding the timely development of safe, decent, affordable housing in Vermont communities in order to identify areas in which flexibility or discretion are available. Also, in order to advise whether the temporary suspension of relevant state rules and local regulations and ordinances or the adoption or amendment of state rules would facilitate faster and less costly revitalization of existing housing and construction of new housing units. A mechanism to ensure that eligible households are sheltered until transitional or permanent housing is available. And lastly, strategies to reduce reliance on hotels and motels for emergency housing. For the purpose of conducting its work, the task force had the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of DCF. It was required to submit a report on or before January 15th of this year, which it has done. Both committees have received that. There's some language about calling the meetings to order and quorums. I don't know that we need to go through that this morning. And then language about compensation and reimbursement for the members of the group. So that is the charge.
Thank you. And just very briefly, I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee as well as being on Health and Welfare. And last year was very challenging when this bill came to us. A lot of work was done by your committee, by the House Human Services Committee. It was an amazing amount of work and included some appropriations. The process for looking at a bill that has an appropriation is to send it to the Appropriations Committee. That was done after our committee had reviewed some of the policy there. There were significant differences between what was in the governor's budget and the negotiation with the governor, as well as with the House and the Senate. So that is one reason why this very large issue with a huge budget ended up being finally negotiated through the appropriations process. But it was not without Representative Wood, who did a huge amount of work on this, and as well as those of us in the Senate who tried to contribute to making this the language a reality, and then having the report come out. So that's kind of the process. I don't know. Some folks are not familiar with that, and some are. I thought that would be helpful to you.
Folks have any questions from Katie about what the charge of the task force was? Okay, great. Thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
So we were fortunate to have two folks to co-chair the task force. Sarah Russell from the city of Burlington and Representative Jubilee McGill. And Sarah was not able to join us today. As you can imagine, with the weather, she does homelessness services in the city of Burlington. She is really stretched very thin right now. And so Jubilee has graciously agreed to present the work of the task force, and we'll let her go through the report. You can, again, find it on your webpage. I think Senate members might have a written copy of it. And the floor is yours, Jubilee.
Your chair. Hi, everyone. So yes, the name is Jubilee McGill. I will note that, yes, I'm a representative, but I was appointed to the task force as a member of lived experience. As a young adult, I was in and out of homelessness, so I have experience living in congregate shelter. I have experience living in a hotel paid through this program. I have experience living in non-congregate shelter. And congregate shelter. And I have the really horrific experience of living unsheltered in Vermont. Especially, there's a lot of horrible things that happen when you live unsheltered that we don't really talk about, especially as a young woman. And I really just want to highlight this because this report is really kind of focused on one population, or one kind of one segment of our entire homelessness systems of care and people who are really needing services. I heard from some representatives who in their evenings in the city of Burlington go out and feed people who are experiencing homelessness. And one recounted sometimes he comes across piles of women huddled together, sharing blankets with men standing guard around them to keep them safe because they face sexual and physical assaults on a regular basis. And so we have these discussions and we talk about dollars and we talk about units and beds, but these are people, these are Vermonters, these are our community members, our neighbors, our constituents, and they have built a sense of community. And they're seeing their community members abducted into sex trafficking and disappear, never to be seen or heard from again. So while this is really important work and a really important piece of this whole system of care, I want to make sure we're also looking at all pieces as we go about our work this biennium. So yeah, Katie did a wonderful rundown of this task force. We started meeting. We met 8 times from September to December. We are. Sorry, I haven't had I also just want to give a caveat. My daughter, my oldest child, has been in the hospital, and that has taken a significant amount of my time. And you've heard from Teresa that Sarah has been the person who spearheaded the cold weather shelters that popped up in Burlington when we had those really, really cold weather conditions to keep people alive. And then immediately after came down with a pretty significant sickness. So we have not, and I have not had a lot of time to repair. So I will unfortunately just be doing a lot of reading from the report. And I just want to make sure everyone has been able to find it. Okay, good. So yeah, a little history. The GA Emergency Housing Program has existed in the state for years. A lot of folks, it didn't really get on their radar until COVID happened. And it was a really powerful tool where we could keep people safe and prevent the spread of COVID. And so it helped keep our communities safe and helped prevent the spread in our communities. And so post-pandemic, it's kind of been the only tool we have. Our shelters, I believe it's a little over 500 shelter beds is what we have in the state. And there's about 3,500 people experiencing homelessness in Vermont, according to our last PIT count. So we do not have nearly enough resources in our state to serve the people in need. And so this has been kind of the only other tool we've had. And I think we're going to continue to see a rise in homelessness. I don't feel confident that things like poverty and the conditions that lead to it are really going to be getting any better in the near future. So this, we really need to be thinking about how we're going to address it on a state level, since we don't have much control on the federal level. I'll skip that part. Go over some of the challenges. We had 12 pretty comprehensive. Yes.
I'm just wondering, do you want to share your screen?
I'm just looking at the report.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm not sure everybody has a technology device. Would people like to see it on the screen or not?
Any hard copies?
Kiki, do you have any spare hard copies?
If I get it back, you can have it.
Okay.
I have it on the screen, so I can.
Okay, here, we've got a couple. Is anybody good? Anybody need one?
We're good? Are we good?
Yeah, we're good. Okay, I just wanted to make sure it was accessible for everybody in the room, that's all. Here's another one in case anybody needs it.
So we had 12 comprehensive directives and we're allowed 8 meetings. And it was not enough time. We could have, some of these directives or charges probably could have been their own task force. In fact, one of them was. That was one of the greatest challenges. Another significant challenge is we had no guidance around budget considerations. Our first few meetings, honestly, the bulk of the time we went in this roundabout circle of, but what will this do to the budget, or should we consider the budget? And so we couldn't even focus on the tasks at hand because we just kept having this kind of circular argument on how we should approach this. So in the future, I think having more guidance around those kind of things would be really helpful. In the end, we decided that these were our directives. There was no mention of the budget. And so we approached it as how the policy part without thinking about the dollar part. How can we create the most impactful system and series of changes? And decided we would let the legislature figure the money part out. Then, and I also do want to talk about, Katie mentioned the per diems. When we first started initially, we met for 2 hours and quickly realized we needed to extend those hours to even really begin to meet the task before us. So then we went to 4 hours, and by the end, we were meeting 6 or 7 hours each time. And I want to note that the people who usually receive that per diem rate are our lived experience experts. They are not paid by an organization to be there. And so when you think about $50 and then you think about 7 hours of work, we are saying these people's experience is valuable. We want that experience. And then we are not even paying them minimum wage. And I think that's really disrespectful. And so I hope we begin to change the way we address per diems going forward. Some of the themes that really kind of larger themes that became apparent in our work is providers across the state are struggling with inadequate funding for services. A lot of the people who are doing this work in our communities are paid $20, $25 an hour. And so they are diligently showing up every day, doing really, really hard work and facing housing insecurity themselves, struggling to feed their families, pay their bills, and keep a roof over their own head. So I think another thing in our work over this year when we are making our budget recommendations is really making sure that we are not sending the people who we're expecting to do the work to solve this crisis into homelessness themselves. So that leads to further instability of our shelter and service options, and can really serve to destabilize our system, which is already inadequate. And another thing that we heard, and I know lots of us receive emails about is our annual funding cycles. It is really hard to hire people and to budget when you really never know what you're going to get until a few weeks before the budget goes into effect. So in addition to not being well paid, these people are always constantly facing uncertainty in their own financial future and job security. And it makes it really hard to support the administrative functions to maintain healthy organizations that we're really counting on. We also, we accepted public comment at every meeting, written and some folks coming and speaking in person. And we released the report and allowed people to submit more public comment, and you'll find that in appendix at the back. One of the suggestions that was made to us by our CAP agencies was a peer-led service model. We've seen really great success, and we have data that peer-led models are really effective. And we are facing a severe staffing shortage at all of our service providers around the state. My work outside the legislature, I am the assistant director of the Vermont Coalition of Runaway and Homeless Youth Programs, and we receive federal funding that we then administer around the state. And every single one of our organizations that we fund is severely understaffed and has multiple positions that they are unable to fill. And so peer-led service models allow us to ensure that work gets done. And it also is a pathway to really meaningful employment for people experiencing homelessness. So we really wanted to recognize that and lift that up. And then, our closing we put in our executive summary is that this is not a destination, but really a direction for our leaders, all of you, to lean. They reflect the perspective, expertise, and insight of task force members and feedback we learned during public forums, including the experience of people with lived experience of homelessness and housing insecurity. This is an opening for exploration and meaningful discussion to determine what is necessary to prevent unsheltered homelessness and ensure that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. And then I will just read out the list of task force members. For folks, we have Miranda Gray, who's our Deputy Commissioner of the Economic Services Division in the Department for Children and Families. Lily Sojourner, who's the Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity within the Department for Children and Families. And she was appointed to fill the DCF's Commissioner Chris Winter's spot. Elizabeth Gilman, the Executive Director of United Way in Vermont 211. Molly Dugan, the Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives at Cathedral Square, and she was the rep for the Long-Term Care Crisis Coalition. We had Brenda Siegel, the Director of End Homelessness Vermont, and she was the representative for the Vermont Center for Independent Living. Frank Kanak, who's the Executive Director of the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont. Amy Johnson is the Government and Affairs and Communications Director for Vermont Care Partners, who she was the representative for. Myself, who has a member with lived experience. Sarah Russell, who is the co-chair, and she is the Special Assistant to End Homelessness for the City of Burlington. And she is a member with experience operating an emergency shelter, which she does really well. Sean Gilpin is the Housing Division Director from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development and was appointed by ACCD's Commissioner. Polly Major, who is the Director of Policy and Special Projects for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. Shelby LeBaron, who is the other member with lived experience. As we are taking testimony on around homelessness and poverty, I really hope you will reach out to Shelby. She has a more recent experience in the GA emergency housing program and now works to help folks who are either in the program currently or need help accessing it. So she is a really wealth of knowledge. And then we have Christopher Laras, who is the Homeless Response Coordinator for the City of Rutland. And he was appointed by the Vermont Leagues of Cities and Towns. I do want to note that Polly Major, the rep from VHCB, went on leave a few weeks into, or a few meetings into our work. And so she was replaced by Lise Greaves, who also works for VHCB. So yeah, again, we kind of mentioned the challenges around the meeting adequately being able to address all 12 charges in the time allotted. But I will, first I'll go over committee process. So yeah, we met 8 times. They were originally 2 hours, but as I said, given the number and breadth of the charges, we extended that to 4 hours, and then eventually had to move to all-day meetings to really finalize our recommendations. The meetings were hybrid, so some of us were in person and some of us joined by Zoom. That was also challenging. It's much easier to have a conversation when you're all gathered in a room. But given the work of all of the people on the task force and the crises we were all dealing with during this time, this was when we saw mass exits of people from the hotels who had reached their 80-day caps. So we were all quite busy in our outside work in addition to trying to get this done. So unfortunately, all being able to gather in a room was not always possible. Given the wide range of experience and perspectives on the task force and a lot of opinions, we decided we were going to consider each recommendation individually because it became really hard to move on without knowing what we had decided in one area. So each of these recommendations were voted on. Our recommendations for each charge were just looked at and taken a vote on each recommendation. And that's kind of what made it in the final report. We were not able to come up with recommendations for every charge. And so if in those instances, we did put some of the themes we talked about and discussed and decided we would leave it up for all of us to take up again this biennium and make those decisions. The recommendations in the report were approved by a majority of the task force members. And if folks voted in the minority, they were given the option once the draft report was released to submit a minority report. And then, as I said, the initial report was released publicly and allowed for an opportunity for the public to review and make comment, and those weren't attached in the appendix. There was a recommendation from the CAP agencies that you can find on the task force webpage through the DCF website that accidentally did not get added into the appendix. So I will email all of that out to you all as well, because I think it has some really great ideas, including the peer-led support. And then do we want to take questions now, or do you want to wait until I get through the recommendations?
It's up to you, really. What are you comfortable with?
I'm fine. I'll take some now. I'll let that
Good. Go ahead. Could someone I have a question if no one else does. Thank you, Jubilee. This is really interesting. And my question is just, right out of the gate, I see the household eligibility, which is very important to all of this. When I look at the vote, it looks like 5 people were absent that day, which is a substantial number of the group. And I understand I was on a working group this summer too. So, but I'm wondering, just out of curiosity, were the folks who were absent generally in favor of these criteria?
Consistently, we had 3 members abstain and 1 member who was absent for all meetings except for half the meeting. So otherwise, except for in a couple of instances, the remainder of the task force were in agreement.
Just a second. So 3 members who abstained, members of the administration?
Members of the administration, and then as I mentioned, Polly from VHCB went on leave.
Right.
So we did have someone to replace her, Elise Greaves, but she's not given the authority to make decisions.
Gotcha. And the absent member, was that somebody who was representing, it must have been an official member who was appointed.
Yes, that was our representative for the Agency on Commerce and Community Development.
So the housing person
Yes.
didn't come primarily. Okay. I mean, not okay, but thank you. Okay. Any other questions before we delve into the recs? Okay.
Okay. So one thing I forgot to mention and wasn't really noted in the process is we ultimately, what we decided to help keep us focused and moving along was we took the GA emergency housing bill from last year and just kind of used that for some of these as a guide, as a starting point. So some of it will look very familiar if you're familiar from that bill from last year. And will look very familiar when you see the bill for this year. So first, household, one was household eligibility, maximum days of eligibility, application, notice, and appeals processes, participant requirements, and annual reporting requirements. So we kind of broke these out. That is a lot. So for household eligibility, this will look very similar. There were a few changes. We have criteria shall include a household that has a member of the family who is 60 years of age or older, is pregnant, is experiencing domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, hate violence, or other dangerous or life-threatening conditions that relate to violence against the individual or a household member that caused the household to lose its housing, or have experienced domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, hate violence. Oops, this is double. It's yes. So all of those same things while the household member was living in GA, in a GA-funded motel, or while living unsheltered or in precarious housing. So that last bit is something we added because we heard from people out in the field that folks who were in GA housing, who were unsheltered or living in precarious housing situations, were not being deemed eligible if they otherwise met this criteria. So we felt it was really important to spell out that if someone is raped while they're living in a tent, then they should qualify. If someone is raped while they're or stalked or experience hate while they are living in a GA emergency housing, that should not cause them to lose their voucher. They should remain housed. So we just wanted to spell that out and make that really clear. As a child age 19 or younger, that remained the same. One element we added is youth exiting foster care age 19 to 24 years of age. We know, I know it from my work and from all of the data we collect, that people experiencing homelessness are much more likely to go on to chronic homelessness if we can't address it when they're at this really fragile age. Especially, we also know that people experiencing chronic homelessness are much more likely to have been in our state's care as a minor. And so we have a lot of resources that we thankfully receive to help these youth, but they're not enough. And so I worked with the folks at the Youth Development Program and was able to get a figure. This would, at that time, it was about an additional 75 eligible people that would add to our numbers, but it would have a profound impact on the trajectory of their lives. F has a disability defined by ADA, and not only a disability, but has to have one of these, a written verification of the disability from a professional license by the state to diagnose and treat the disability, and certification that the disability is expected to be long continuing or of indefinite duration and substantially impedes the individual's ability to live independently. Written verification from the Social Security Administration, receipt of a disability check, intake staff recorded observation of a disability not later than 45 days after the application for assistance is confirmed and accompanied by evidence of this, or other documentation approved by either the department or the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or a form developed by the department as a means of documenting a qualifying disability or health condition that requires the applicant's name, date of birth, last four digits of their social security number or other identifying number, a description of their disability or health condition, a description of the risk posed to the applicant's health, safety, or welfare if temporary emergency housing is not authorized pursuant to this section, and a certification of a healthcare provider as defined in our state's statute that also includes their state credentials, credential numbers, address, and phone number. And then the final eligibility categories is homeless due to a natural disaster, homeless due to a death of a child or partner that leads to their homelessness, or is homeless due to a constructive eviction. And a constructive eviction is one where an eviction happened due to something outside of the household's ability to control. That could be perhaps their landlord is selling the building, or the apartment has been deemed no longer safe for human living, things like that. And then we have a resource test that is being used right now that helps determine households' eligibility and self-pay nights. And so an additional recommendation we added was removing that resource test entirely, so that savings are not taken into consideration, because we want folks to be able to reserve their resources for when they do find housing. I'm happy to answer questions about any of these, or we can move on to the next.
Go ahead, Representative Steady.
Very concerning about disabling and enabling young adults, the youth that's sitting in foster care, age 19 to 24 years. That's concerning to me because I worry about enabling young adults, and are they going to be required to show that they're looking for a job, et cetera?
We'll get into that, but all participants in the program we'll get into that. I'd like to push back on enabling. All the data shows that when you provide youth with the resources they need to thrive, they succeed, they thrive. So I'm happy to meet with you and provide you with that data. That's why our government, regardless of the political affiliation of leadership, has funded services like this. We just celebrated the 50-year anniversary of the RYE Act, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, which provides services to do exactly that, because the data shows year after year after year, when you invest in this population, they thrive.
So I would welcome questions that relate to understanding the material that we have on the report. This isn't really a time for debating the report. And when we look at the bill, we're going to be starting this in the House. So when we look at the construction of a bill, there'll be lots of opportunity for testimony and debate at that time. So just want people to be clear. We're not debating the task force work. We're just asking questions for clarification.
Oh, then I have another one. Where it says the savings, will there be a cap on the savings?
That would be a question that we'll discuss when we get to the committee work.
Okay.
Okay, so think of this as like a template to begin the conversation.
Right.
When you
Okay.
take up the bill and this will be on the table, then you can decide, is this the best language, or are there other things that you need to include or take away?
Thank you, Jenny.
Any further?
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'll move on to maximum days of eligibility. And I can note on this, for the first section, we had 6 yeses, 0 nos, 2 abstained, and then 5 absent. For the second part, we had 9 yeses, 2 abstained, and 2 absent. Maximum days of eligibility. Households will be eligible for the GA Emergency Housing Program motel stay until homelessness is resolved, or household has refused to engage in coordinated entry and or adequate housing case management, or household becomes ineligible based on the above criteria I covered in that first section, or household has used their max length of stay within a 12-month period. You'll look down at that note. Our recommendation is that the maximum length of stay shall be the equivalent to the average length of stay as determined by Measure 1 from the HUD system performance measures. Right now, that is currently more than a year. We went with this because it is a incentive for us to actually start doing something. We talked about in our committee as we were making our recommendations for the BAA that we keep putting money in this, but we're not doing anything about the bigger problem and creating alternatives. So this holds us accountable to actually doing that. If we want to reduce those maximum days of eligibility, then we need to be doing that other hard work. We also recommended, we want the legislature to look at the existing requirement around accepting alternative shelter and housing to ensure it meets the needs of households, and also believe there should be a legal review to make sure our state is complying with the Olmstead decision. There's noted there's been some instances where we believe decisions were made that actually violated that decision. So we want to make sure our state isn't prevent our state from getting sued. Application, any questions on those areas? Okay. Application, notice, and appeals. We determined that notice, application, and appeals process must be clearly defined and provided in writing to all households, and minimizing the level of discretion of AHS currently has to develop rules for program execution and implementation. Denial letters will be issued at each denial, and all denial letters from ESD must include the reason for the denial, clear instructions for the appeal process, and contact information for legal services and participants' rights related to reasonable accommodation. Households should be able to apply either in person or over the phone, and there should be a mechanism for virtual application, income reporting, et cetera, that should be developed by Economic Services. Looking into perhaps an app or a portal. We did it during COVID, and we believe that should be something we do now. And protections must be in place and developed by the Vermont network to ensure households that experience domestic violence during their motel stay ensure their continued eligibility. We added it up above, but it was so important, we wanted to make sure it was here as well. And our task force vote was yes, 8 voting yes, 0 voting no, 2 abstained, and there were 3 absent. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more about instances where someone who may be a victim of domestic violence or otherwise loses their eligibility for GA? I'm just not familiar with those circumstances.
Let's say that a household, there's a domestic violence, there's a dispute, and one is clearly the victim, but both members were exited from the hotel given a period of ineligibility. And so basically punishing a victim, survivor of domestic violence.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, so this is great. Can you explain why you wanted to minimize the level of discretion AHS currently has, develop rules for program execution and implementation, like where that came from?
Exactly for reasons like the domestic violence issue. It's been something that I think that was raised frequently with them, and there haven't been changes made. And so a lot of the service providers felt there needs to be more oversight in the rules of this program.
Nope.
Okay, program requirements. And Representative Steady, this gets a little bit into one of your questions. Okay, Households deemed eligible under the above criteria must meet the following requirements. Engagement with coordinated entry and/or approved housing case management. Activities shall include at least one of the following: completing the coordinated entry assessment, engaging with providers to secure an alternative housing placement, addressing barriers to permanent housing, or applying for permanent housing vouchers. We recommended a change. Currently, the practice is income certification for folks participating in the program are required to verify their income at least every 30 days. For some folks, it's based on how frequently they receive that income. So if they're paid weekly, they're doing an income certification weekly. And if you have ever had to help someone with this process, it can take a while. There are a lot of things you have to gather, then you have to get through and actually do the certification, which often means taking time off work. So our recommendation was that we do an income certification instead every 90 days instead of the current practice, and believe this will actually reduce some of the costs of administering this program. When you are recertifying people that frequently, it takes a lot of staff time in the department. So I think this will help with some of that and help reduce some of those administrative costs that are related to the program. Again, we say the legislature should also take a look at the existing requirement around accepting alternative shelter and housing to meet the needs of households, and that there should be a legal review to make sure our state is complying with the Olmstead decision. Questions, clarifications? Yeah.
Sorry.
Go for it.
During the, because you said it was 30 days before, now it's 90, is that what
It's
you're?
at least 30 days.
At least 30 days.
Some people are, it's as frequent, it's 30 days or as frequently as you receive
Right.
your source of income.
I don't know, you might not know off the top of your head, but do you know how often between those 30 days or between the periods of checking in for certifying your income, how often that would change? Or is it, I'm saying, like, how often do people lose their jobs, or how often do people lose some of their income between the check-ins? Because obviously, yeah, what you're saying makes sense. You don't want to have unnecessary paperwork and spending money when people aren't realistically losing much of their income. So that makes sense.
From my experience and what I understand, not very frequently. And then this would just be like all of the other housing, federal housing requirements actually do it annually. And what you do is you kind of do calculations to create like an annual income. And then that's what you stick with, unless there's a massive change in income. So they could request an income recertification if they lost their job, or, maybe they got promoted, or maybe they're working 40 hours a week instead of 20 hours a week. But otherwise, all other areas really of our government have said, let's stick with the annual recertification. We thought this was a happy compromise to doing it so frequently the way we are currently.
Can I ask a question?
Actually, not from the audience today. Yeah, so that's okay.
I'm happy to follow up with folks in the audience after this hearing. Okay, reporting requirements. AHS, this is something that they have been doing, and I personally find them really helpful, is giving us reports of the status of the program and numbers. So AHS will provide monthly reports detailing the following statewide and by district, households served, kind of a population breakdown, households eligible but not able to serve due to room capacity, number of motel rooms kind of in the portfolio, And to the extent possible, because we do understand that it's not always possible to collect all of this data. The number of households exited for reasons in the following categories, that they became ineligible based on the criteria, behavior-based exits from the program, because they obtained permanent housing, or because they obtained community-based shelter bed. And then obviously that other category, because it's good to always have a catch-all. In all instances above, data should not be provided publicly in cases where the number is below 12 to protect confidentiality. However, local data may be shared with the coordinated entry lead agency when households are enrolled in coordinated entry. And I do want to explain this because in some towns, the populations are so small that folks have a bit of an idea, and we want to do as much as we can to protect people's privacy and do what we can to protect folks from stigma. We're seeing a rise in threats and violence towards this population. That's really concerning. ESD will designate a representative in each district to serve as point of contact for the lead agencies. And the ESD point of contact will attend local case conferencing circles when there's a coordinated entry ROI release of information in place. And our vote on this was 7 yes, 3 abstaining, and 3 absent. Okay. On to recommendation 2. Sorry, that one was a big one. There's a lot of points. Okay, this charge was the process to establish a single statewide unified coordinated entry system with participation from the department. We agreed there's already a unified system, coordinated entry system that exists. I think speaking from experience, there is lots of room for improvement. And there is a lot of inequity on how that system operates in different areas of our state. But we have something that we can build on that exists. In partnership with Chittenden County Homeless Alliance and the Balance of State COC, the Office of Economic Opportunity will determine benchmarks, requirements, and outcomes, which include the following. Expanded standards for service provision, field-based services opposed to office-based services. Best practice is to meet people where they're at. People are more likely to be successful if we can bring services to them rather than requiring them to figure out transportation, figure out how to take time off from work or other responsibilities to get into an office. Scope of service related to engagement, role of case management and performance indicators, and training and professional development for case management staff, which includes adequate funding to reduce wait times for a connection to case management services. Currently, due to staffing and underfunding, quite honestly, of services, wait times are as much as 6 months before a person can actually get connected to a case manager to receive those essential services to engage in housing navigation and fill out applications. And yeah, adequate funding to reduce wait times for the coordinated entry assessment and enrollment. Again, 6 months to even get on the coordinated entry wait list, where they then become eligible for housing opportunities in our state.
So Brett McGill, is that 6-month wait, could that be lessened? And I sort of, looking ahead a little bit to your recommendations, that a broadened role of the other departments and contractors in the Agency of Human Services. Lots of these folks actually already see, not all of them, but a lot of them are connected to other points in the service system in the Agency of Human Services, but not all of those other, whether it's community providers or departments, are connected with the coordinated entry system. Is that Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and you'll see further on in our recommendations, we do get into that. And I will note, it's like, not like 6 months everywhere, and it's not all the time. But it's happened. And sometimes in some areas, that is the wait time to even get an assessment done and get on the wait list. So yes, there is an agreement that AHS and its contractors must engage with and participate within the coordinated entry system to include adequately funding and training adequately funding training for contractors to provide housing-related case management, investing in workforce development for direct service workers, including providing professional development. One thing we hear over and over is the level of need is just higher. The complex needs that folks are presenting with are often completely out of the range of skills that our case managers have. And so we're seeing it more and more. And so this is really, we need to equip our workers to address the needs of our communities. There is acknowledgement that the needs of households have shifted in acuity and require intervention that is at times clinical in nature. And therefore, AHS, which includes ESD, DALE, FSD, DMH, VDH, DCF, et cetera, and their contractors and subgrantees, including but not limited to our AAAs, mental health and SUD designated agencies, CDD and parent-child centers must engage in providing coordinated entry assessment and housing navigation services. Training and housing navigation must be provided to AH staff and contractors, and housing navigation must be part of the role of staff and contractors. Like I said, we see this in some areas, some of our local housing coalitions. The designated agencies are part of that system, and others they're not. So there really is this inequity of resources and what's available to Vermonters depending on where they live or which hotel and which county they wind up in. So these recommendations are really aimed at creating a robust system of services that individuals and households have access to, regardless of where they might be staying each night. 3, the current organization, any questions on that recommendation? 3, the current organization of roles and responsibilities within the Department for Children and Families, Office of Economic Opportunity, and the Division of Economic Services. There is agreement that AHS must shift to a role of shelter provider with regard to the GA emergency housing program and hold accountability for the participants within this program, providing data and reports statewide and regionally as outlined above. And the department should always have the ability to make reasonable accommodations. Sometimes service providers hear that, well, this is what the legislature said, and so this is what we're sticking to. So we want to make it clear that in significant cases, the department can use their best judgment or the agency to make reasonable accommodations. There is agreement that AHS and its contractors must participate in the statewide coordinated entry system, including utilization of HMIS as outlined above in the first recommendation or second recommendation, and that AHS should develop contracts with motel, hotel owners indicating agreements around participant conduct, I always struggle with this word, habitability standards, and owner responsibilities. AHS will consider purchase of motel, hotel in instances when available to operate the site as a shelter. with consideration of transition to permanent housing and/or in partnership with nonprofit housing providers. AHS will designate staff to be assigned and on-site at each motel, hotel, or multiple motel, hotels, numbers dependent, to coordinate services and serve as a liaison between owner, case managers, and households. We had a task force vote of 7 saying yes, 3 abstaining, and 3 absent.
Representative Bishop.
The last recommendation about on-site staff to serve in a coordination of services role, how does that compare to the current situation?
It's just, again, getting at that that equity, because that's not always the case. And so when a community is completely under-resourced and understaffed, and then this would ensure that there is that connection to our statewide kind of system. It's just taking a more accountable role in the way our services are delivered.
Thank you.
Representative Steady.
Just curious, when it says on site, would they get a motel room and stay right there? I don't understand.
All the motel rooms have community. I mean, the way a motel functions, there are places, even if it's the lobby, where someone can at least come. These are motels, so they often, or if they have a conference room, it depends on what that looks like in the motel. But that gives the individual or household the opportunity to go and meet with them on site.
Oh, so, okay, so they would not staying
Not
there.
staying
That's-
there.
Oh, yeah, not overnight care. We saw this a lot during the pandemic. I was in direct service during that time. We partially funded by FEMA and CARES funding. We had the conference rooms, and we had resources. We had harm reduction supplies. We had applications and diapers and all of the things to kind of lift up and fill gaps. And this is really, we need to continue that in this current crisis.
I think it sounds like what the report is recommending is we kind of have a shelter system right now that kind of has the have and the have not. So we have formal shelters that have all those things that you just talked about. And then we have hotels and motels that really is just, in the past and currently really is viewed as a economic benefit. And it's a voucher essentially for a place to lay your head and be undercover. And what I'm sensing from the report is that the task force is recommending that really we should be looking at the whole continuum of these supports and services as formal shelter services, and not just as a voucher.
Again,
Getting at those supportive
the
services.
level of service you receive should not depend on where you happen to be laying down your head that night.
The reason is I started this program in 2014 when I worked for DCF, and it's just gotten so big and it worked so well back then. It's just confusing how come it's not working now. That's all.
It was actually
Confusing to me because I did house the homeless. I was first person to do it, and it seemed to work so well back then, and now it just doesn't seem to be working.
Well, I think that there's obviously the complexity. We heard from the task force, the complexity of needs that people are presenting, there's a lot of variables, the high cost of housing now. You used to be able to rent an apartment for an affordable rate. People with vouchers can't even find apartments. So there's a lot of variables that go into.
And I will say, we've always, as a state for decades, kind of hovered under this 1,000 people experiencing homelessness. It dropped lower and things will be good and we get closer up to that 1,000. We react and bring it down, but it never really got over that. We are at, like I said, about 3,500 or well over 3,000 people.
3 times that number.
Yeah.
It
that are
started
homeless.
off, I think I had 500 in 2014.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just confusing to me how come it's gotten worse. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. I had original and then you just gave me another one. Do you happen to know why? Are there any reports or indicators of why it's gone up from that like 1,000 you said like rough average to you said like 3,500 now? Or
Yeah,
it's obviously the floods and people losing their homes is definitely attributing. There's no way it's not.
We are seeing, it's that shift. We are seeing more people at the top and more people, and we're losing that middle group of people, and that middle group of people has now moved down into more and more are existing below the poverty line. It's really the economy and the level of poverty. We lost a lot of our housing stock due to flooding. A lot of people have lost their homes, and we've seen an influx of people moving into the state. And when a landlord is given the decision of housing a doctor or someone who works in the gas station, they're going to choose the doctor every time.
So, yeah, and we're seeing obviously a rise in rentals. I think there's, sometimes people have the perception that, that folks who are homeless are not working. There is a large cohort of them that actually are working, have jobs, and still can't afford to pay for housing at the cost that it is now. Rep. Garofano.
I just want to make a comment to help maybe answer that question. We had a presentation from Public Assets Institute yesterday, so it might be helpful for folks to look at that report because it explains the poverty rates in Vermont and how many families are paying 50+% of their income to their housing cost and food and other costs that have gone up exponentially in the last few years. So it just might help explain why this number keeps growing. Just want to offer that.
Yeah, if you were living on the edge, prior to 5 years ago, and then all of the things that have happened, with the economy and the pandemic and housing crisis, you're not living on the edge anymore. You've had this happen to you, so
Fallen off the cliff.
yeah, you have, yeah. Yeah.
I was just gonna suggest that we keep moving through the recommendations.
And wait till the end.
But there's a lot of information that is underneath all of this.
Yeah.
Could spend all day doing that.
And I was just wondering about maybe at 10:30, so people know that we'll take a break. Does that work for people? Good. Okay.
Okay, number 4, the number and types of emergency shelter spaces needed and currently available for each geographic region in the state, with a preference for non-congregate shelter spaces. And this is work that's kind of happening right now. So our recommendation is the Housing and Homelessness Alliance of Vermont will work with community and state partners and both continua of care to develop an annual report to detail scale and type of emergency shelter required to meet the need. Have to check in with Frank. It was they had to do some data, so we didn't quite have it ready to incorporate into this. But it is something they calculate anyways, and based on pit count that will be changing. So we thought we should just recommend that this happens kind of every year, and an annual report be received, so we can work, probably the January 15th date or when all of the reports kind of come flooding in, so that we this body both bodies of the State House can have that information, and because that will likely change year to year. 5, the identification of a consistent lead agency for each geographic region. Each region currently has a lead agency for administration of the coordinated entry system. The state must ensure adequate funding for each lead agency. The amount they receive through our collaborative hub application doesn't even begin to cover the costs that they incur. So a lot of these, even with funding, are losing money by doing this really valuable data collection work. So we need to ensure that they have adequate funding. But with that additional funding, we want to require that they determine benchmarks and procedure related to, identifying the CA system lead staff members, define roles and responsibilities for outcomes of the coordinated entry system, lead to include wait time for assessments. I talked about how, some areas have seen as much as 6 months. Interim service provision until households can be assigned to case management, timely data entry for HMIS, complete assessment data entered into HMIS include all areas of the coordinated entry assessment, contingency planning when there is a wait time to conduct assessments and or connection to case management, processes for communication and workflow when a case manager is not connected to the CA system, their CE system, and policies for expansion of the coordinated entry partners within the region and statewide. So this really just kind of calls for defining those roles and responsibilities, creating outcomes and measures we want to meet, and then that gives us the information we need to legislate that and fund that. 6, the identification of role and responsibility. Just see above, we kind of combine those together. 7, potential adjustments to emergency housing policy during cold weather months. Adverse weather conditions must include relaxed eligibility requirements to avoid exposure to death, to align with the closure of Vermont state parks for the season. October 15th to April 15th is the date those parks close. And that is what, partly because that is when they begin to see a risk of things like pipes freezing and utilities being damaged if they're not shut off. So we figured if it was significant enough to shut down our state parks, it's probably a significant indicator that it's not safe for people to be living in those same conditions. There is agreement that adequate funding and support for seasonal low barrier shelter must be provided. That is a huge gap in our current system. We have the GA program, we have our shelters, but then there's everyone else. For those really cold nights or really hot days, there needs to be places for them to live. And I mean live. Because otherwise we will see a loss of life or extreme damage to their health. So we wanted to add that in. Task force vote, 7 yes, 3 abstain, 3 absent. It's a recurring vote count theme, you'll see. 8, a process to enable participating households to place a percentage of the household's gross income into savings which shall be returned to the household for permanent housing expenses when the household exit the general assistance emergency housing. We recommended changes to the current practice of income contribution and self-pay nights. We ultimately we ran out of time to kind of come to a full final decision or recommendation, and also recognize that some of these options involved stakeholders who weren't there at the table. The treasurer, we thought there existed some possibilities there. What services or help implementing this could they provide? Yeah, we just didn't have time to really flesh that out. So we instead listed some of the things we discussed and thought that the legislature was better equipped to take this up this session. Three options that we discussed and agreed to pass along to the legislature, that there should be no income contribution due to the majority of people who are in the program having significantly low incomes. The income contribution, just figuring out those self-pay nights, again, is an administrative burden. And it prevents available resources for housing. It's seen as like, well, this reduces the cost of the program. But then these folks, when they do find housing, don't have a security deposit. They don't have first month's rent. And so instead we pay that money through our HOP emergency funds that each local housing team has. So we're still paying. It's like taking money from here and shuffling it over here. Income contributions, the next option, income contributions should follow a standard similar or identical to the Section 8 calculation of any income contribution, and that contribution should go towards savings to access housing needs like furniture, kitchen supplies, basic needs, or return to the household after exit. Another possibility, 30% income contribution for households above 200% of the poverty line. 50% of income contribution will defray the cost of motel stay. 50% of income contribution will be paid in savings escrow to be returned to the household upon exit for things like housing. So we considered a variety of options like no self-pay, putting it all in savings, or doing a split. We'll leave it to all of us to kind of make those final decisions on what we think might be the best path.
McGill, did you sort of formally run shelters? Do they require any kind of participation by the individual?
Yeah,
in terms of a contract or anything?
Not that I know. There's shelters, like I worked in a shelter where we would work with, like, encouraged it and would help them save. Like we had a safe that we would keep it in because they felt like they wouldn't be able to save if it were in a bank. That. So, but not to my understanding. Do we charge people for staying in shelter, which again is that issue of inequity and where you happen to get to lay your head each night, and what
thank you,
your experience is. 9, a mechanism for addressing potential conduct challenges posed by a member of a participating household served in a motel, hotel, shelter. The members of the task force agree periods of ineligibility shall be removed. Challenges related to either conduct or more often a person's disability should instead be addressed using the same principles as a housing first model. Individuals should be met where they are at to work with them on addressing these challenges, and when necessary, working with clients to move households to an environment that has a better chance at success, understanding that this may take multiple tries for some households. This does not prohibit a hotel from getting a no trespass, addressing challenges through the criminal legal system, or choosing not to renew a household. This still gives hotel owners voice and choice and who they have there, but also ensures that we are not leaving people in the dark, in the elements, often for a symptom of their disability. And the task force vote on this was 7 yes, 3 abstain, 3 absent. Number 10, the identification of any state rules and local regulations and ordinances that are impeding the timely development of safe, decent, affordable housing in Vermont communities in order to identify areas in which flexibility or discretion are available, and advise whether the temporary suspension of relevant state rules and local regulations and ordinances, or the adoption or amendment of state rules would facilitate faster and less costly revitalization of existing housing and construction of new housing units. This committee recognizes that there is work being led by the Affordable Housing Development Regulatory Incentive Study Committee, which was established by Act 181. Section 37 to make recommendations related to these issues. Their work has involved extensive input of stakeholders led by the Vermont Department of Housing and Community Development with the participation by VHCB staff. Their final report was not yet final when we did our report, but it is anticipated to be comprehensive in nature, addressing detailed recommendations regarding obstacles to affordable housing development. The committee recognizes that their in-depth work will be of value considering a variety of steps to reduce barriers to expedited development and does not want to duplicate these efforts. Did not feel like a good use of our very limited time. But in the meantime, we wanted to highlight and recommend some of the key priorities we learned that they were pursuing, including ensuring that there's consistent capital available to fund projects that are moving through the development pipeline. Without confidence in the availability of funding, it is impossible for developers to advance critically needed housing projects. Speeding up and streamlining the appeals process to provide an expedited and consolidated appeal review for PHP, affordable, inclusionary zoning, or projects that meet a threshold for affordability. Provide for certainty about the timeline for consideration. 2, affordable housing developed in the 1A tier should be excluded from appeals. These areas have already been planned for development. 3, for both tier 1A and 1B, consideration should be given for moving from an opt-in to an opt-out approach to minimize the potential for some communities to maintain higher barriers to affordable housing than others. Then this committee also recommends the following. The corrective action plan process currently can take as much as a year to complete, slowing down projects and therefore increasing costs. We recommend that efforts be made to reduce the timeline to no more than 6 months. That any building that has been zoned for use as a hotel or motel be automatically allowed to be converted for use as shelter and permanent supportive housing for households exiting homelessness. And then in addition, we recommended the Act 181 committee and legislature consider the following questions. Explore a mechanism to ensure no other zoning conditions exist which impact capacity of developed shelter and or permanent supportive housing units is not decreased during conversion for motel use. So other than that one, those recommendations were presented to us first kind of batch from VHCB, from our representative from VHCB, Elise Greaves, and we agreed with them. We wanted to add this additional last one because something we're seeing is even when they can purchase a hotel, there is, as soon as that change of use happens, let's say it's a 30-room hotel, because of zoning, it suddenly gets down and it can only be a 10-room shelter. So we wanted to explore mechanisms to ensure we can have that max capacity if wanted. Doesn't make it, maybe it's a better model for that building to be 20 rooms, but gives them that capacity to not, that option of not reducing capacity when it changes use. 11A, a mechanism to ensure that eligible households are sheltered until transitional or permanent housing is available. And that we just ask you to look back at under section 1, the maximum days of eligibility. And then do you want me to stop or just get through that final recommendation?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and then we'll take a little break between when you're done and before the department.
And 12, strategies to reduce reliance on hotels and motels for emergency housing. The task force received a number of recommendations for this charge, and we did not have time to consider them all. We also expect to receive additional recommendations, which we did. and that we are sure will deserve review and consideration by the legislature. We decided not to take a vote and instead have included the barriers and recommendations we did discuss. Further recommendations from the public and service providers will be included in the appendix in the final version of this report. And I implore you to listen as they reach out over the course of this session. I don't know what happened to A. The legislature solicit feedback from providers to determine impediments to development of emergency shelter. Increase funding for agency infrastructure, HR, accounting, lack of clinical expertise due to acuity of need, mental health, substance use disorder, medical challenges, etc., must be addressed. We need increased disability supports and services. I think that is a huge theme we saw last session, last biennium in our work in our community. All over the belt, we are severely lacking in our supports and services for Vermonters with disabilities. Lack of physical space, buildings, et cetera, to adequately provide congregate, semi-congregate, and non-congregate shelter options. We thought perhaps some alternative housing options to consider, dormitories, tiny homes with zoning changes that actually allow for them, individual or campuses with community space models, which are really effective, mixed or low income, single room occupancies, Habitat for Humanity. The caveat with Habitat for Humanity, we have conversations with them, is they are not the landing space for someone just out of exiting homelessness, but they have expressed a willingness to work with us and a possible path forward for folks who have been stabilized. It can be an incredible symbiotic relationship for seniors, or needing someone to live with them to sustain their housing and finding housing for someone who needs it. So that was something we wanted to include as something to explore. That was for Home Share Vermont. Habitat for Humanity also, that is another possibility we should look into. Currently, there's this issue that exists where you've got to have the income to have the copay. It's a really powerful program. There's the income levels to qualify, and then actually having the income to pay that portion that they're required is a very, very tiny slice of the pie. And so working with Habitat to Humanity, what kind of funding do they need to open up this resource to more Vermonters? Consider the needs and preferences of those experiencing homelessness, including pets, smoking, criminal history, transportation options, proximity to services. Those all can be huge barriers to people experiencing homelessness. Systemic changes, additional rental vouchers, VSHA, expansion of our family unification vouchers, family supportive housing, all of those. Especially as we are likely to see reductions in the funding for vouchers we see, or actually we've already know where, I believe with the housing choice vouchers, we have confirmed a reduction in vouchers we will be able to provide in the state with federal funding. Address regulations that prevent shelter and combat NIMBY ordinances. And adjust regulatory hurdles for tiny homes, single room occupancies, dormitories, et cetera. Consider statewide regulation on short-term rentals regulation, similar to the model used by Burlington, and increased resources for home and community-based care. Service providers need significant additional funding to carry out increased engagement with households and provide robust wraparound services, including peer-led models and housing retention services. There needs to be increased investment in the service sector so that providers can recruit and retain our support staff. And a housing first model should be implemented to ensure that services are robustly available, but not required in order to create a client-centered and client-directed model of care. When necessary, non-traditional case management should be implemented to address barriers. And I want to just point to the most successful housing first model, which is actually through our federal government, which is for our veterans. It is wildly successful. The data is there, and it is completely housing first, and a model I think we should look to as much as possible when we are creating policies in our state. And yeah, I'm not going to go into all the public comments, but I encourage you all to review them. There are lots of recommendations from folks around Vermont who have been doing this work for a long time. It's really valuable lived experience that I think we need to all pay more attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative McGill. Any last questions before we take a break?
Under Act 113, was there any mechanism to remove members from the task force and replace them for any? I see a lot of people that were absent.
Yeah.
And you know, we all serve on lots of bodies and committees, and we're on them for a reason, and that's to show up and to vote. But were there any mechanisms to replace people?
No.
Ooh, ouch.
No, and we also noted further up in the executive summary, I think it needs to be made clearer. We should not have abstentions unless it's like an ethical issue, perhaps. But really, people need to be sending people who have the authority to vote and make decisions. Thank you for highlighting that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Representative McGill, not only for, sharing this report with us, but the work that you and Sarah Russell and the full task force did over the course of many long hours. I went to several of the meetings and people were very dedicated to trying to reach agreement and solve issues and make recommendations. And so I really appreciate the work that you all did. Thank you.
I'll second that. A lot of work here.
And I think it's a good point about, for those of us sitting around the table, when we ask for certain reports, we need to be thinking about what's doable within the time frame that we assign and not just what we think we need to know. So, okay, let's see, what time is it? 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, it's 10:40.